Hello, this is Mr. Mitchell with another video. Here are the questions. Go ahead and write them down, and we're going to talk about Darwin's theory. Here's a picture of Charles Darwin. Now, no one knew of Charles Darwin until 1831. He was a 22-year-old passenger on board the HMS Beagle. HMS, I'm sure, stands for Her Majesty's Service, which means it was out of Britain. And Britain is right over here. So you can see the route that the HMS Beagle took. Now this wouldn't make much sense in a science video unless he found something on the way. He ended up being on this ship, which took 5 years to go around the world, and it wasn't in any hurry. It was stopping and studying places and visiting places. And one of the places they visited was the Galapagos Islands. I don't know if you can tell, but it says Galapagos here. These islands are off the coast of South America. Charles Darwin would end up becoming the naturalist on the ship, someone who studies nature, and so he kind of ended up that being his job, and he definitely did his job at the Galapagos Islands. He observed how the plants and animals were different in different parts of the world, and it was really evident here in the Galapagos Islands. It's not that they were strange animals, it was just that they were different from the animals here in South America, but slightly different. You may remember we had a video earlier in the year where it talked about how these animals in South America had some adaptations that he thought their ancestors brought to made in the Galapagos Islands. Well, I'll detail that in a little bit. The plants and animals were similar, but some characteristics were altered by nature. For example, iguanas on the island had large claws. Iguanas on the Galapagos Islands had large claws to grip the slippery rocks, but they did not have large claws on the mainland of South America. Tortoises, turtle-like animals, had different kind of shells. They had the saddle-shaped shells on the islands, whereas on the mainland they did not have the saddle-shaped shells. It seemed like the ones on the island were adapting to get the food or to manage on the rocks there. And here's a picture of these animals. You can see the long claws here of this iguana, adapted to the slippery rocks here. You can see this saddle-like area here. Let me get a red marker. So the neck can go up to reach leaves that are like on the bottom layer of these trees here. So, but you didn't find that on the mainland. So how do you get these animals, which seem to be related on one body of land, and then on the islands have these animals which are closely related but have these different variations where they can walk around and on the rocks and to where they can get their food? And another example was these finches. Now these finches were different on most each of the islands. You can see the beaks, and I think we've actually mentioned this, but some are more adapted to reaching in and getting worms. Some are more adapted to pounding and opening areas like, I guess, nuts and stuff like that. And others seem to have different adaptations. So all these traits are called adaptations. It's a trait that helps an organism survive and reproduce. So if you had these iguanas without these long claws, they probably didn't manage very well on the Galapagos Islands. The ones that didn't manage well died out. The ones that did survived. The tortoises that had the shells like this are the ones that were able to get the leaves from the trees. The others supposedly died out. The finches that did not have long beaks to get the worms down in crevices supposedly died out on that particular island where that's where the food was. Darwin spent the next 20 years investigating and studying adaptations. He found that fascinating. Why would you have adaptations for animals that look so close? Over many generations, he reasoned that the plants and animals on the Galapagos Islands face different environmental conditions, and it was the different environmental conditions that led to these adaptations. And the organisms have to make adaptations to their new conditions in order to survive. And the fact that they survived over many generations, the fact that they made a change, is called evolution. So evolution is a gradual change in a species. Gradual change. So evolution is the fact that there is a gradual change. Darwin saw that a tortoise like this had an ancestor which somewhere along the line ended up coming to the Galapagos Islands. They might have floated on a piece of wood, they might have been just carried there by a ship, but reason that this Galapagos Island tortoise had ancestors that came there. And as a result, they end up making the adaptations to get to the leaves, that they evolved, that these finches evolved from whatever finches happened to be on the mainland so that they could survive, that these iguanas, evolved from whatever iguana came from the mainland so they could survive. And that's what evolution is. Now notice it doesn't say anything yet about all coming from one ancestor. And I think that's what's the most controversial part of what people consider evolution. The technical term for evolution is that there is a gradual change. And there does appear to be a gradual change, or at least it seems reasonable to think that there is. To learn how things evolved, Darwin studied selective breeding. Now you may remember selective breeding. We had, for example, these fish. If you wanted fish with certain characteristics, you saved those fish with certain characteristics, and you didn't reproduce them with all these ones that you didn't want. Remember, we used the example of corn. You might have a field of corn and you take all the best corn and you put them to the side and have them in a field by themselves. So you are actually getting the results you want. Is that what happens in nature? Do all the ones that do not have the right size claws or the right size, right shaped saddled tortoise shells, are all of those culled by nature? Do they die out naturally? And then only the best ones survive? That's a little bit of what Darwin reasoned is happening. Kind of, you may have heard of the term survival of the fittest. And that's exactly where this comes from. Could this be happening in nature? Darwin would say yes. Darwin wrote a book called The Origin of the Species. Or origin of species, not of the species. Well, that's about the most pitiful S I've ever seen right there. Let me make a better S. Wrote a book called Origin of Species, and in that book he proposed that evolution occurs by means of natural selection. Now, we have talked about natural selection before, and I mentioned it just a little while ago. It is that individuals that are better adapted to the environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. The iguanas that are adapted to staying on the rocks are the ones that are going to survive. The tortoises that can reach the leaves on the trees are the ones most likely to survive. Darwin argued that this is pretty obvious in what happens in spiders. In spiders, you have thousands of eggs, but only a few of them survive the best suited. Now, Darwin would conclude that all of these aspects of animals, including us, are a result of natural selection. That the owls, for example, that had the smaller eyes died out. The ones with the larger eyes stayed and reproduced owls with larger eyes. That the ones with disc-shaped faces were not as suited to being an owl, and the ones that did not have the disc-shaped faces did not survive. The feathers that made very little noise when moving around are the ones that were better suited to them surviving. Same thing might be said for the frog here. The ones that have camouflage survived. The ones that did not died out. The ones that could see at night survived. The ones that did not died out. That's kind of the premise of what Darwin would call natural selection. And there are a couple of terms that go with this. Variation is any differences in the species. For example, the owls that don't have the large eyes, that would be a variation, and some variations help species survive, not necessarily all of them. Also, the word competition kind of goes with this as well. All these iguanas that suddenly came from South America to the Galapagos Islands, they were competing with other animals for the same food. And if the animals are not capable of competing with other animals for that food, then they, of course, will die out as well. And that weeds out those that are less adaptive. So the environment has selected which organisms which are breeded and reproduced. It's selective breeding in nature's form. Unfavorable traits over time will disappear according to natural selection. And without variations, natural selection would not occur. Can you imagine this? If all owls were exactly the same, then you would not have any variations. None of them would die out. All of them would survive, but they'd still have to compete for the food. Same thing with humans. If all humans were the same, which you know we're not, then we would not have what scientists think any dying out of humans that could not survive in centuries past. So some interesting things to think about. Hey, make sure you go back and answer the questions. Hope you learned a little bit about Charles Darwin.